I'm a freaking overlord, you idiot! The strongest one in the entire cosmos!
Makai Kingdom, one of the unique underrated games on the PlayStation 2, at the same time notorious for its power leveling of characters and a tireless turn-based game. Just like the same thing with Phantom Brave under the same developers who made it. As the game is one of my favorite childhood games before, I wanted to fully explore and refresh my experience of it, spending more than 144 hours in the game, in order to get that full grasp on what the game actually is. This is K1PM. This time I'll be doing a full review of Makai Kingdom. I'll be going more in depth about the game and pointing out the pros and the cons of it. The game was developed by Nippon Ichi Software, the same developers who made the Disgaea series and their other titles. They're known for making over-the-top leveling of characters in a tactical RPG setting that goes up to like 4-digit level of a character in the game with an insane 6 or more digit stats of a character. And it actually works! I know what you might be thinking. It must be one of those too much grinding kind of games, right? But not exactly, to say the least. The developers always manage to balance things out for the main story of the game really well. With the right strategy and tactics, anyone could manage to beat the game properly. But if you plan on beating the other hidden bosses in the game, that's when grinding becomes a requirement though. The game starts off at the Forbidden Library. The main character, Overlord Zeta, tries to save his own netherworld from destruction according to the prophecy told by Prime the Oracle. He ends up invading this place in order to acquire the sacred tome, but he ends up burning it instead after reading a mocking text of him. This ends up burning the whole place, including his own netherworld. Trying to survive from his own destruction, he ends up confining himself to the sacred tome, leaving his body behind. Despite Zeta's most powerful mana in the universe, he ends up becoming a useless book with a very limited movement he could do. Zeta ends up relying on his minions instead when it comes to fighting, calling them as his very own battle monkeys. With the help of his overlord buddies beside him, they decided to help Zeta out on recovering his lost netherworld and his own lost body, while facing some troubles in between, clashing battles against different enemies, armies, rebels, and even overlords along the way. As Zeta becomes the sacred tome himself, he ends up attaining the ability to grant wishes at the cost of the writer's mana. Depending on how huge the wish can be, it can really drain a writer's mana that badly, even for an overlord. The main plot of the story is actually simple when you think about it. A powerful man tries to recover on what he lost after a certain event happened, while having some conflicts with the other overlord and his struggling relationship with his former student, Salome. He ends up recovering from it all in the end. Well, depending on which ending a player manages to get, that is. But what I really like about it is the delivery of the story and the well-established characters. I've enjoyed a lot of hilarious jokes and dialogues along the way, with their quality fully voiced lines both on the English and the Japanese dub. They fit really well with every character in the game, surprisingly, as well as how intriguingly interesting the story can be along the way, that branches up to 6 different possible endings, 1 good ending and 5 bad endings, depending on the player's amount of total ally kills, a win or a lose in a boss battle, or even from a hidden boss battle within some of the chapters in the game. There are also 4 extra bad endings from the last one I've mentioned, but those are just kind of a mini endings, or rather more of an Easter egg kind. Although, it just kinda upsets me that most of the cutscenes within the game are like these, instead of these kinds of cutscenes that I wanted to see. But this is just a minor thing, I guess. The direction of the story is still pretty much good though. Way back then, during my childhood days of playing the game, my first impression of it was a bit of a shocking to me. At the very start of the game, I really thought that this game is gonna be like Valkyrie Profile, with a more updated look and different take to it. Then later on, as the battle starts, I didn't expect it'll be like Final Fantasy Tactics, without the whole tile-based movements. At the same time, a bit like Vagrant's story when it comes to the whole sphere or radius range of attacks. It's the same formula on what they did on their previous game with Phantom Brave, but with a more slightly different mechanics on what they did here. Making a turn-based game that doesn't follow a tile set of rules is actually a unique idea that is rarely seen. But in this game's case, it has a few problems that comes with it. It's rather hard to get used to this kind of setup, especially without knowing the estimation range of an enemy's attacks. Usually in a tactical RPG scenario when going into a battle, you can just set up your units, line them up, and you're good to go. Fighting off the enemy on the map, or how other games lets you capture different enemy bases. In Makai Kingdom's case, you don't just place units at any given turn at a certain range, but can also place vehicles in the map and especially even buildings. Like, damn! And those buildings inside it, you can place your units, vehicles, or even your items in there before the battle starts. While every kind of building has their own strengths and weaknesses that are really useful. You can also take cover inside or above it, or can even act as a wall to waste your enemy's turn. Now the vehicles themselves is actually nice. I really love the setup that the game has for the vehicles. There's a ton of different kinds, having their own set of strengths and weaknesses, as well as having their own set of unique animation attacks that differentiates from one vehicle to another. Although the vehicles can be disappointing in a way, it's not exactly that the vehicles is that strong compared to the units themselves, especially with the whole reincarnation mechanic involved for the units. The vehicles ends up becoming more of a means of transportation instead of a combat vehicle later on. Both the buildings and the vehicles have a very interesting concept on what they have here, but it's just a shame that they didn't end up repeating this kind of concept anymore. But at least they end up retaining the whole lifting and throwing of a character. This actually broadens up the possible tactical advantages of it in the game, as well as taking advantage on the whole out of bounds within every stages. But of course, this doesn't affect on the other units or bosses in the game. As Zeta became the Sacred Tome, he's actually really useful. Aside from placing stuff in the map, anything that Zeta receives, it ends up returning it globally within the whole map. Meaning, if you plan on healing your entire team but it's not exactly within the range of your healer, you could actually easily just cast a healing spell on Zeta, as it ends up healing the whole entire units on the map. Although, it'll end up healing the enemies also. Not to mention, if anyone ends up striking Zeta, this ends up damaging everyone on the field. And if your attack is that strong, you could actually kill Zeta that ends up in a game over screen though, as well as disabling the invite of any other units, vehicles, or even buildings anymore. I kinda actually like this kind of idea on what they did here. Although it can be a bit challenging considering you gotta defend Zeta from enemies trying to hit him. After the whole battle ordeal, I really like the game's touch on the home base of the game. I could actually place where my characters stand on, drive some vehicles around the place, and place any buildings anywhere I want. I could also even go so far as to beat each of my characters up. The characters could talk about interesting stuff within the game, set up their own shop, and other helpful means for the player. I was even surprised that I can actually level up my merchant as long as I end up spending a ton of money for her. Like, dang. It's a great alternative way of leveling if you're that lazy on farming in the game, but it'll cost you though, just like in real life. Although, the shop items in the game, it's not actually that great. You can't purchase every type of weapon in the game, or even buy any consumable items, which is a must for an RPG kind of game. Well, I guess not every kind. But on this game's case, you gotta really need it, especially when you're farming on the dungeons. You could only acquire them during in a battle, at which the chances can be really low. They kinda mess it up on this one. Aside from that, it's kinda unfortunate how there's a limit on the amount of stuff that I could place in the map. I'm not exactly quite sure why they decided to put a cap on it, but I'm quite sure it's not because of the hardware limitations of the PS2, considering how strong the PS2 can be back then. When it comes to creating your very own character, I find the game can be quite tricky. It's not a simple recruit a unit, then power them up all throughout the way, but instead, it relies heavily on searching for the right object in order to transmute it into a desired class character. It's a bit complicated considering there's an insane amount of different items in the game, that you gotta have to watch out for the rarity of the item and its affinity towards the stats. After you level up your characters, you're able to reincarnate them for an unlimited amount of times in order to change their class into a much more higher one, as well as increasing the character's stats gain when they level up. And when you end up reincarnating a character, you'll end up going back to level 1. And that's where the grinding begins. Not only you'll be aiming for the stats, but also be aiming for the different amount of skills within every different classes. Although, it's not necessary to aim for that kind, but it actually shows how vast the amount of experimentation you could do in this game. You could even make your very own character that has every skill in the game. If you're a fan of power leveling of characters, this might be the game for you. But if not, well, at least it's not a requirement when doing the main story. That's what's important. The only reason that grinding became necessary is when fighting off against secret hidden bosses in the game. You could actually fight off against every characters on this game, even the ones from the Disgaea series and Phantom Brave. And they can be extremely difficult to beat. You'll have to grind for days, literally days, in order to just beat them up, especially when fighting off against the other overlords such as Bal himself. It took me like 144 plus hours in the game just to beat the strongest boss. And I didn't even count the failed amount of times that I grinded in the game. Although, it's unfortunate that there's more characters on the PSP version and not here on the PS2 version, considering it's a more updated version of the game. Unfortunately, there's no English port of it though. Remember that insane amount of items I mentioned a while ago? I'm actually amazed how vast the amount of weapon types that are within the game. Not only does the game have those standard type of weapons that's usually seen in a game, but how really weird some of the weapons can be. Swords, katanas, spears, spellbooks, those are all just basic stuff. But have you seen weapons such as these kinds? Like, who the heck thought of making a damn balloon into a weapon? Or even this apple pie that can heal your ally with it? It's just crazy that I think it's a bit too much. Although I kinda actually like it, to be honest. Although there's a huge drawback on what they did here. The first one is the differentiation of skills attacks in a weapon. You could see here like daggers, swords, and even spears has a ton of possible skills could do. And then when you're gonna look at this side, it's just sad that some of the weapons has so little amount of possible attacks. Why would they put this amount of so much type of weapons if they couldn't even give enough skills to use it on? What's the point of the whole weapon mastery then? Especially the UFO weapon for stealing stuff from the enemy. Any characters who uses that weapon ends up unlocking every moveset of it immediately. Kind of feels like upsetting when you think about it, right? It's just disappointing when I end up realizing this problem along the way. Goes to show how the developers didn't actually polish it off properly. They just keep on adding new stuff into the mix. Aside from that, it's actually really stressful considering how messy the inventory system can be. Sure, you can actually easily sort them out over here, but there's no easier way to sort them out on the selection of the item I wanted to see. Now, the level design within the game is actually interesting. Some of the stages within the game are fixed, while the other stages are completely randomized with a set of levels, mixing up into a whole new stage. The different parts of the stages can be unlocked through either eliminating the enemy key holder, inviting a unit or building on that side, or just throw any items that are located on the map to that area to be unlocked. There's also a random chance that an event would appear, spawning specific enemies, items, or even giving out global debuffs to the whole units in the map. The art design is actually decent. The character sprites are pretty well made, so as the design within the buildings. Although I really wish they could add more scenes like this one though. It's much more interesting and engaging to see it this way, rather than having to go back to this part for most of the dialogues in the game. It kind of feels lazy a bit on what they did here. What I find remarkable about Makai Kingdom is how great the soundtrack of the game can be, especially during the dialogues within each part of the story, and especially the battle themes within the game. It has that intense sense of elegancy in the battlefield that it feels like a last stand in a huge event, or how some of the soundtrack has that strong sense of adventurous feel to it. that made me enjoy the game a lot more. Not to mention how unique the melody and the tones can be in the game, that made me remember most of the soundtrack in the game during all these years. It's kinda sad for the lack of appreciation by many of how good the soundtrack can actually be. As much as I praise the game this far, it's not actually that perfect. The game suffers from a moderate amount of bugs that ends up ruining or spoiling the game for me. I end up encountering a lot of these kind of situations that ends up becoming a big deal for me. I have a feeling that the developers didn't manage to go back to this kind of setup because the amount of bugs and problem it has. That's why I give this game a rating of 8 out of 10. Makai Kingdom is an interesting, unique tactical RPG. It gives out a refreshing change of playing this kind of game, and how I like the concept on what they try to go for, especially how amusing the story dialogues can be. Although, as much as I really love the game, it's a shame how they couldn't polish it off really well. They could have done better, but they end up leaving some of the problems in the game. Not only in terms on the amount of bugs that a game has, but how lacking some of the game's unique features have. But at least the game is still enjoyable overall, not to mention how entertaining the cutscenes can be in the game. Now, would I recommend you on playing the game? If you're really that curious about it, especially on the tactical RPG genre, you could give it a shot. If you're curious about the content of it, you could actually check out on one of my 100% playthrough video of it down below in the description. I also have a compilation of every cutscenes in the game if you wanna, including all the bad endings in the game that you might enjoy. For more videos such as these, why not head down to my channel to check things out? I do accurate game reviews of the past games, and some other new ones too. If you wanna support my channel, a subscribe would be nice. It kinda helps me out morally, to be honest. This is K1PM, and I bid you farewell.